I always find it somewhat interesting that we are told that Jesus, as a young man, he grew up as learning the trade of being a carpenter. And yet all of the parables that we hear, there's not one parable that I can recall. Now, you might be smarter in Scripture than I am. But I don't recall ever seeing a parable about a carpenter or a story about a carpenter. But I do hear week after week, very often, the parables that we've been hearing last week and again tonight, using the parables speaking of agriculture. And each time that Jesus uses these parables, he is trying to make an important point. As I said last week, he's not trying to teach us a class in agriculture. He teaches us a class about living the gospel. Now, the people had heard this short little parable. I took a portion of it tonight. The people of Palestine would have had no trouble understanding the point of this story. When weeds were planted and began to grow, it was understood that weeds would most likely sprout among the weeds. It just seemed to be one of the dangers of planting in Palestine. It was often difficult to identify what was good growth and what was weed. So as the growth process continued, the roots sort of got tangled together, and it was almost impossible to remove the weeds and then to save the wheat. And so the decision was made to say, let it come to fruition, let them grow together. And then at harvest time, when it was really time, they would separate the weeds and the wheat, because the weeds were toxic and would do great damage. Our world today is not how God made it or intended it to be. God would not necessarily be happy with the way our world is being lived today. When we read the account of the creation in the book of Genesis, we are told that God saw all that he had created, and it was good. He kind of smiled and said, this is wonderful, the creation that I've put together here. God made a good and perfect creation. Unfortunately, with time, the weeds of violence and selfishness, the weeds of hatred, discrimination, and greed began to grow. And God, I'm sure, had to, at one point, maybe despair of his creation that had gone wrong. It's not what he wanted. He wanted to have a better world. And I'm sure he might have even had the thought, should I just uproot the good and the bad and start all over? But God decided to let the weeds and the wheat continue to grow. And as we try to live as faithful followers of Jesus, it is easy, I think, to be overwhelmed and sometimes discouraged by the weeds of evil and division that permeate much of our modern society today. It's depressing sometimes. To illustrate that point, I often did this with teens. I would get a large white poster board, if you wish, and I would take a colored pencil of some sort or crayon, and I'd write a small little dot in there. And then I would hold that up to the teens, and I'd say, what do you see? Almost in every case, there's a dot on there. And I said, yeah, that's true. I said, do you see anything else? And then they would take a little focus and say, he's trying to trick us somewhere. And eventually they would come to the point and say, yeah, we see all of that whiteness. And I would say, bingo. It's so easy to focus on the negative, on the dot, on the weed, and forget the wheat, and forget the whiteness into the goodness that our world can have. And I think that's very important that we keep that in mind. As I said, it is so easy to focus on that dot. We are saddened by the evils of society. We're saddened at abortion, drug abuse, gang violence, racism, terrorism, acts of violence, all abuses of human goodness and dignity. We can all come up with a list of the injustices in our world or the imperfections of our own church, and we know we've had some bad moments. We're always aware of the financial burdens that we carry, the sicknesses that burden us, and the terrible grief that we feel when a loved one dies. All of these things are certainly real. These are the weeds of our life. We know them, and we must confront them. But I would rather, and I think as Christians we should, focus on the good that is present when the hungry are fed, when strangers are welcomed, when the poor are treated with dignity, when the sick are cared for and consoled, and when the good news of the gospel is proclaimed boldly. These, I think, are visible signs that the harvest is really good. Oh, the weeds are around, but the harvest can be good when we live the gospel as we should. We must also remind ourselves of the presence of goodness that is around us. When we share a common vision of service, we share generosity and courage and love for others, we can be sure that God will make the good wheat grow. And we need to look no further than right here. You, the people of Our Lady of the Lake, our visitors who are faithful followers of Jesus. It is your good works that help us move away from the dot and begin to see all the goodness that the world has. Because you are living the gospel and trying to proclaim it in the little things that you do. In all those insignificant, that seem insignificant, little acts of kindness helps the wheat grow. All these examples of goodness are really a reflection of God's presence. They are the wheat that grows despite the intrusion of weeds. I encourage all of us to recognize the goodness and grace in the events of our lives. When we recognize that goodness and grace, we can find strength to oppose what is evil and the joy to live as God's people, as God wanted his people to live. If we focus only on the weeds, we can begin to lose heart and become very discouraged. But if we can see and embrace the wheat of God's presence, then we find the freedom to build God's kingdom and the hope that comes from living in God's great love.